This old photo went unnoticed for 100 years, until someone zoomed in. The photograph arrived at the Chicago History Museum in March 2024, part of a large donation from the estate of a former journalist who'd spent decades collecting images of Black Chicago, Dr. Marcus Thompson, a curator specializing in African American history and the Great Migration, sorted through hundreds of images, church gatherings, street scenes, family portraits, each one a precious fragment of lives that had been systematically excluded from mainstream historical narratives. This particular photograph was dated February 17, 1919, and showed a crowd gathered on South State Street in Chicago's Black Belt, the thriving neighborhood where hundreds of thousands of Black Americans had migrated, seeking opportunity and freedom from Southern oppression. The image captured a moment of celebration. Black soldiers in their military uniforms returned from the Great War in Europe, surrounded by community members, men in suits and hats, women in their finest dresses, children perched on shoulders to see the heroes who'd served their country. The photograph had been published in the Chicago Defender, the influential Black newspaper, in February 1919. Marcus had seen similar images before, homecoming celebrations for the thousands of Black soldiers who'd fought in France, who'd experienced a measure of respect abroad that their own country denied them at home. These men had returned with new expectations, having proven their courage and patriotism, believing perhaps that their service would earn them the citizenship rights they'd been denied. Marcus scanned the image into the museum's high-resolution digital archive system, a process that would preserve it and make it accessible to researchers. As the scan completed, he examined it on his computer screen, noting details for the catalog entry. Approximately 50 people visible, State Street storefronts in the background, midwinter, based on the heavy coats and scarves. Then, following standard procedure, he zoomed in to examine details that might help identify specific individuals or provide historical context. He moved across faces, noting expressions of pride and joy, examining the soldiers' uniforms for unit insignia, checking storefronts for business names that might help verify the location. He zoomed toward the back of the crowd, where the image grew grainier but still showed people standing in doorways and on steps, watching the celebration. And there, in the shadow of a doorway, barely visible in the darkness, was a woman. Marcus increased the magnification, adjusting brightness and contrast. The woman was thin, dressed in a dark coat and hat that made her blend into the shadows. Her face was turned slightly away from the camera, as if she didn't want to be photographed. But her hands were visible, and she was holding something. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. He enhanced the image further, using the museum's advanced restoration software to bring out details that would have been invisible to anyone looking at the original print. The woman was holding a sign, a piece of cardboard or wood, roughly 2 feet by 3 feet. And on that sign, in hand-painted letters now barely legible even with enhancement, were words that made Marcus's breath catch. They served. They returned. They were murdered. Below the main text, smaller words listed names and places: Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee. Marcus sat back from his screen, his mind racing. This photograph, published in a Black newspaper in February 1919, captured in its margins someone documenting what the celebration couldn't acknowledge: that Black veterans returning from war were being lynched in the South, killed for wearing their uniforms, for claiming the dignity they'd earned. And this woman, hiding in the shadows, had been there to bear witness. Marcus spent the next several days immersed in research, rebuilding the context of that February 1919 photograph. The Great War had ended in November 1918, and by early 1919, Black soldiers were returning home to a country that had changed and yet remained brutally the same. Over 350,000 Black men had served in the war, and thousands had fought in combat units despite military segregation and racist assumptions about their capabilities. In France, these soldiers had been treated with a respect many had never experienced in America. They'd fought alongside French troops, been welcomed in French communities, experienced life without constant fear and humiliation. Now they were returning to a country where white supremacy was violently reasserting itself, threatened by Black veterans who no longer accepted second-class citizenship without question. Marcus pulled up research on what historians called the Red Summer of 1919, a wave of white supremacist violence that swept across America in the months following the war's end. Race riots erupted in dozens of cities. In the South, Black veterans were targeted specifically, lynched for wearing their uniforms, for not showing sufficient deference, for the crime of having proven their equality through military service. The violence was documented but rarely prosecuted. White mobs attacked with impunity while law enforcement looked away or participated. Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender tried to report these atrocities, but mainstream white press largely ignored them or blamed Black communities for the violence directed against them. Marcus found records of specific cases from early 1919, just around the time of the photograph. In Georgia, a soldier named William had been lynched 2 weeks after returning home, killed for refusing to step off a sidewalk when a white man approached. In Alabama, 2 veterans had been dragged from a train and murdered for wearing their uniforms. In Mississippi, a soldier had been beaten to death for trying to vote, his uniform torn from his body and burned. The homecoming celebration captured in the photograph represented one side of the black veteran experience: community pride, recognition, hope. But the woman with the sign represented the other side: the terror, the murders, the systemic violence waiting for these men if they returned to the South, or even if they asserted their rights in the North. Marcus enlarged the photograph again, studying the woman's posture. She stood apart from the celebration, in shadow, almost invisible. Her sign was positioned so that most of the crowd wouldn't have seen it, but the camera had captured it. Had she known? Had she positioned herself deliberately so that this evidence would be preserved? He examined the soldiers' faces again, their expressions of pride and determination. Did they know what awaited so many of their brothers? Did the celebrating crowd know, even as they welcomed these heroes home, that dozens of black veterans had already been murdered? The photograph suddenly felt less like a simple celebration and more like a document of profound complexity. Joy and terror existing simultaneously, hope shadowed by brutal reality. A community honoring its heroes while knowing that heroism wouldn't protect them from white supremacist violence. Marcus needed to know more about the woman in the shadows. Who was she? Why had she brought that sign? What happened to her afterward? Marcus reached out to Dr. Evelyn Crawford, a historian at Northwestern University who specialized in black activism and resistance during the early 20th century. They'd collaborated before on exhibitions about the Great Migration and the development of Black Chicago's political and cultural institutions. When Evelyn saw the enhanced image of the woman with the sign, her response was immediate. I need to see the original photograph, and I need access to Chicago Defender archives from 1919. They met at the museum 2 days later. Marcus had prepared a detailed file: the original photograph, the enhanced versions showing the woman and her sign, historical context about black veterans and racial violence in 1919, and preliminary research on the homecoming celebration itself. Evelyn studied the images intently, using a magnifying glass on the highest resolution prints. The sign is hand-painted, probably made recently before this photograph, she observed. The lettering is careful, deliberate. This wasn't a spontaneous protest. She planned this. But why stand in the shadows? Marcus asked. If she wanted to protest, why hide? She wasn't hiding, Evelyn corrected. She was documenting. Look at her position. She's far enough from the celebration not to disrupt it, but positioned where the camera could capture her. She wanted this recorded. Marcus pulled up the published version of the photograph from the February 19th, 1919 edition of the Chicago Defender. The image as printed was darker, the woman in the doorway completely invisible. The newspaper couldn't see her in the print, he noted. Or chose not to see her, Evelyn suggested. The Defender was reporting on lynchings, but they were also trying to maintain community morale, celebrate achievements. A protest sign in the middle of a homecoming celebration might have been too complicated, too painful. They searched through other Defender issues from early 1919, looking for any mention of protests or demonstrations related to veteran lynchings. The paper ran regular reports on violence against black people, including specific articles about murdered veterans, but nothing about anyone protesting at this particular homecoming event. She may have been acting alone, Evelyn said, or as part of a small group that the mainstream, even the black press, didn't acknowledge. Marcus found something in a March 1919 issue. A small notice about a committee for veteran justice that was collecting documentation about attacks on black soldiers. The notice asked readers to send information to a post office box in Chicago's South Side. That could be connected, Evelyn said. Someone was systematically gathering evidence. Let me check archives at the Newberry Library. They have collections of black activist organization records from this period. Over the next week, Evelyn traced references to anti-lynching activism in Chicago during 1919. The city had multiple organizations working on these issues, including the NAACP chapter, church-based groups, and women's clubs. But specific information about a committee for veteran justice was harder to find. No incorporation papers, no meeting minutes, no membership lists in the usual archives. Then Evelyn found something in an unexpected place: police surveillance records. In 1919, Chicago police, like law enforcement across the country, monitored black activist organizations, considering them potentially radical or subversive, especially those that challenged racial violence. A report from March 1919 mentioned briefly, Negress? Distributing pamphlets about soldier lynchings, warned to cease activities. No name was given, but the date and description matched the time frame of the photograph. Marcus and Evelyn expanded their search, now looking for any references to black women activists in Chicago in early 1919 who were specifically focused on violence against veterans. The challenge was enormous. Women's activism was often underdocumented compared to men's, and black women's work was even more systematically erased from historical records. Evelyn contacted colleagues across the country. historians who specialized in black women's activism, in anti-lynching movements, in the complicated politics of the Great Migration period. She shared the photograph, the enhanced images, the fragments of information they'd gathered. Dr. Angela Harris, a historian at Howard University, responded within days. "I think I know who she might be," Angela wrote. "There was a woman named Ida, not Ida B. Wells, but someone who worked in similar ways. She's barely mentioned in records, but I've seen her name a few times in connection with documentation of lynchings. Let me search my files." 3 days later, Angela sent a detailed email. She'd found references in church records from Olivet Baptist Church, one of Chicago's largest black congregations. The church had hosted meetings about racial violence, and minutes from a February 1919 gathering mentioned Sister Ida presenting evidence of atrocities against our soldiers in the South. No last name was recorded, but there was a notation. Sister Ida continues her dangerous work of documentation despite warnings. Marcus felt a surge of recognition. That matches the police surveillance report. She was warned to stop her activities. Evelyn found more pieces. A letter from March 1919, preserved in the personal papers of a Defender editor, referenced the woman who's been documenting every soldier lynching. She's going to get herself killed if she keeps this up. Well, still no full name, but the references were building a portrait, a woman acting as a one-person documentation project, gathering evidence of murders, presenting it to churches and community organizations, refusing to stop despite danger. Then Marcus found the breakthrough. In the Defender's archives, he discovered a letter to the editor from April 1919, never published. The letter was signed Ida Freeman, and it read, "I write to correct your report of March 23rd regarding the murder of Corporal James in Georgia. You state he was killed in an altercation. This is false. I have testimony from 3 witnesses that Corporal James was dragged from his home by a white mob and lynched for refusing to call a white boy sir. His uniform was torn from his body. His mother kept the bloodied jacket. I have seen it. I have photographed it. We must stop using gentle language for murder. We must document these crimes precisely, or history will forget them." The letter was fierce, uncompromising, and it provided a full name, Ida Freeman. Marcus searched census records. In the 1920 Chicago census, he found an Ida Freeman, age 28, listed as a lodger in a South Side boarding house, occupation listed as domestic worker. Born in Mississippi, migrated to Chicago around 1917, but there was no Ida Freeman in the 1930 census. She disappeared from records. "She either left Chicago, married and changed her name, or died," Evelyn said. "Given the context, the warnings, the dangerous work she was doing, we need to consider the possibility that something happened to her." Marcus pulled up death records for Chicago, 1919, 1925. The records were incomplete, especially for black residents whose deaths were often less carefully documented than white residents. But after hours of searching, he found an entry from August 1919. Ida Freeman, Negro female, age approximately 27, found deceased in alley near 35th Street. Cause of death, undetermined. No investigation pursued. The brief death record sent chills through Marcus. Found deceased in alley, because undetermined. No investigation pursued. For a black woman in 1919 Chicago, especially one doing work that challenged white supremacy, this was a death that authorities had chosen not to examine. Marcus and Evelyn knew they needed more information about Ida's death and her life. Angela Harris traveled from Washington, D.C. to join the investigation, and together the 3 historians began piecing together Ida's story from fragments scattered across archives. They found Ida in the 1910 Mississippi census, living in a small town near Jackson. She was 18 years old, living with her parents who worked as sharecroppers. By 1917, she'd migrated to Chicago, one of hundreds of thousands of black Southerners seeking escape from Jim Crow violence and economic exploitation. Church records from Olivet Baptist showed Ida becoming a member in 1917. She attended regularly, participated in the Women's Auxiliary, and by 1918 was noted as someone who assists families in distress. Then, in late 1918 and early 1919, references to Ida's work became more specific and more troubling. A letter from a church elder to the pastor, dated January 1919, expressed concern. "Sister Ida's work documenting Southern atrocities is important, but increasingly dangerous. She receives threatening letters. Some in the congregation fear her presence draws unwanted attention from authorities and from white supremacist groups who have threatened northern black communities." Marcus found copies of some of those threatening letters preserved in police files. They were vicious, racist, promising violence if the Negress didn't stop spreading lies about the South. But Ida had continued. In February 1919, she'd stood in that doorway during the homecoming celebration, holding her sign, ensuring that someone, the photographer, history, would document that even in this moment of joy, black veterans were being murdered. Evelyn discovered that Ida had been compiling a detailed record of veteran lynchings: names, dates, locations, circumstances, witnesses when possible. She'd been traveling, carefully and at great personal risk, interviewing families of murdered soldiers, collecting evidence, taking photographs when she could obtain them. One family, reached through descendants living in Chicago, still had letters Ida had sent them. Mrs. Dorothy, age 87, showed the historians a letter from March 1919. Dear Mrs. Williams, I'm writing to extend my deepest sorrow for the loss of your son, Corporal Thomas Williams, murdered in Alabama on February 12, 1919. I'm documenting these crimes against our soldiers so that history cannot deny them. Would you be willing to share your son's story? I promise to honor his memory and ensure his sacrifice is remembered. With sympathy and solidarity, Ida Freeman. The letter was careful, respectful, but also determined. Ida had been building a comprehensive record, understanding that without documentation, these murders would be forgotten or dismissed. She was doing the work that should have been done by the government, Angela observed, systematically documenting racial terrorism, creating evidence that couldn't be denied. But someone had wanted that work stopped. The threatening letters made that clear. And Ida's death in August 1919, just 6 months after the photograph, just months after her most intensive documentation work, suggested that those threats had been carried out. Marcus found one more crucial piece: a police report from late July 1919, weeks before Ida's death, noting that she'd reported being followed by white men who threatened her. The officer's notation was dismissive. Negress claims harassment, advised to avoid causing trouble. The three historians realized that if Ida had been systematically documenting veteran lynchings, she must have created an archive: photographs, testimonies, records. But where was it? Nothing like that had been found after her death, and it wasn't in any known collection. Evelyn started with Olivet Baptist Church, searching through their storage for any boxes or files that might date to 1919. Churches had often served as repositories for important community documents, places where sensitive materials could be kept relatively safe. After 2 days of searching through decades of accumulated records, Evelyn found a locked metal box in the church's basement storage, labeled simply IDF 1919. The church's current pastor had no memory of what the initials meant, but he authorized opening it. Inside were Ida's records, dozens of folders containing testimony, letters, photographs, and newspaper clippings. It was a comprehensive archive of racial violence against black veterans from November 1918 through July 1919. Marcus carefully examined the materials, his hands trembling at the significance of what they'd found. Ida had documented 67 murders of black veterans in 8 months. Lynchings, beatings, shootings, murders that had been reported minimally or not at all in mainstream press, that had been dismissed by authorities, that had been systematically ignored. Each case had a folder with the victim's name, military service details, circumstances of death, and when possible, witness testimony and photographs. Ida had traveled to multiple states, corresponded with dozens of families, and created an evidence base that was devastating in its thoroughness. There were photographs, some taken by Ida herself, others provided by families, showing murdered men's bodies, their uniforms, their families in mourning. There were letters from mothers, wives, siblings, describing in heartbreaking detail how their loved ones had been killed. There were newspaper clippings from black newspapers that had reported these deaths, alongside white newspaper clippings that either ignored them or blamed the victims. "This is one of the most important archives of racial violence I've ever seen," Angela said quietly. Ida created a historical record that otherwise wouldn't exist. She ensured these men wouldn't be forgotten. But there was more in the box. At the bottom, wrapped in cloth, was a diary, Ida's personal record of her work. The final entries were from July 1919, just weeks before her death. July 15th, 1919. Received another threatening letter today. They say I will stop or be stopped. Pastor suggests I leave Chicago, go to New York or Canada where I might be safer. But I cannot stop. Every day brings news of another soldier murdered. If I don't document these crimes, who will? July 21st, 1919. Followed again today by 2 white men. I recognized one from the mob photographs from the Chicago riot. They are watching me. I have prepared copies of my documentation and will distribute them to trusted people. If something happens to me, the work must continue. July 28th, 1919. I am afraid, but I think of the mothers who gave their sons to this country's war, only to have them murdered when they returned. I think of the soldiers who believed their service would earn them citizenship, only to be lynched in their uniforms. Fear is small compared to their loss. I will continue. That was the last entry. 2 weeks later, Ida was found dead in an alley. Marcus looked at the archive spread before them. Ida's life work, her courage, her determination to ensure that black veterans' murders were documented and remembered. She'd created this knowing it might cost her life, and it had. Marcus, Evelyn, and Angela began investigating Ida's death more thoroughly, knowing now that she'd been threatened repeatedly and that her death had been dismissed without real investigation. They needed to understand what had happened and why authorities had ignored it. They found the police file thin and dismissive. Ida's body had been discovered on August 12, 1919, in an alley near 35th Street, an area of Chicago's Black Belt. The initial report noted signs of violence but provided no details. No autopsy was conducted, no witnesses were interviewed. The case was closed within days as cause undetermined. But Marcus found something else in researching Chicago newspapers from August 1919. The city had just experienced a devastating race riot from July 27th to August 3rd. White mobs had attacked black neighborhoods, black residents had defended themselves, and the violence had left 38 dead and hundreds injured, with black communities bearing the brunt of the destruction. In the aftermath of that violence, with the city tense and authorities eager to restore order, a black woman's death was apparently considered insignificant, not worthy of investigation, especially if that investigation might reveal inconvenient truths about who had killed her and why. Evelyn found a reference in a black newspaper, the Chicago Whip, from August 16, 1919. A brief mention. Miss Ida Freeman, known for her work documenting violence against our veterans, was found deceased this week. Community members suspect foul play, but police have declined to investigate. Miss Freeman had received threats due to her truth-telling work. It was a small notice, easily overlooked, but it confirmed what the historian suspected. Ida's community had known her work and had recognized her death as murder, even if authorities refused to acknowledge it. Angela tracked down descendants of people who'd been in Ida's circle at Olivet Baptist Church. An elderly woman named Grace, whose grandmother had known Ida, shared a family story. My grandmother said Ida was killed because she wouldn't be quiet about what was happening to our soldiers. She said white men killed her and the police didn't care because she was black and because her work embarrassed people who wanted to pretend everything was fine. Marcus found one more piece of evidence, a letter in the personal papers of a Defender journalist, written in September 1919 that had never been published. The letter, from someone identified only as a concerned citizen, stated, "The murder of Ida Freeman was an assassination, pure and simple. She documented crimes that powerful people wanted forgotten. She was warned to stop. When she refused, she was killed. The police know who did it. White men connected to supremacist organizations, but will not act. This is what happens when we tell truth to power." The pattern was clear. Ida had documented racial terrorism, had compiled evidence that contradicted official narratives of black people as the aggressors in racial violence, had shown systematically that black veterans were being murdered for asserting their humanity. Her work was dangerous to those invested in maintaining white supremacy and in avoiding accountability for racial violence. So she'd been murdered, and her murder had been deliberately ignored by authorities who saw her activism as the problem rather than the violence she documented. She was silenced, Angela said, and then her work was buried. If that church hadn't preserved her archive, all of this would have been lost. Marcus thought about the photograph, Ida standing in shadow holding her sign, documenting even at a moment of celebration that black veterans were being murdered. She'd known the risk. She'd done the work anyway, and she'd paid the ultimate price. The historians faced a profound responsibility. They'd discovered Ida's archive, documented her murder, and now needed to decide how to honor her work and tell her story. This wasn't just historical research. It was about ensuring that Ida's courage and the veterans she documented weren't forgotten again. Marcus proposed a major exhibition at the Chicago History Museum, centered on Ida's archive and the broader context of violence against black veterans in 1919. The exhibition would display the photograph, the enhanced images showing Ida and her sign, selections from her documentation of the 67 murdered veterans, and the story of her assassination. But before moving forward, they wanted to involve descendants of the murdered veterans Ida had documented. If those families still existed, still carried memories and pain from those losses, they deserved to participate in how this history was presented. Angela took on the painstaking work of tracing descendants. Using Ida's meticulous records, which included family members' names and locations, she began reaching out through genealogical databases, church records, and community organizations in the states where the murders had occurred. The responses were powerful. Many families still carried stories of great-grandfathers or great-great-uncles who'd gone to war, come home, and then disappeared or been killed under suspicious circumstances. But they'd never had official documentation, never had their loved ones' military service connected to their murders, never had validation that these weren't just family tragedies, but part of a systematic campaign of terror. One descendant, Thomas, whose great-grandfather had been lynched in Georgia in 1919, wrote, "My family has told the story for generations, but we never had proof. White people in our town always said my great-grandfather must have done something to provoke what happened. Now you're telling me there's documentation, photographs, evidence that he was murdered simply for wearing his uniform? That changes everything. Another family, descendants of a soldier murdered in Mississippi, had been told their ancestor died in an accident. Only through Ida's records did they learn the truth. He'd been beaten to death by a white mob after trying to vote. Marcus organized a gathering in Chicago, bringing together descendants of murdered veterans, historians, and community members. Over 30 families attended, representing soldiers from 8 states, all killed in the months after the war's end. The families shared their stories, their pain, their anger at how long the truth had been hidden, and they expressed profound gratitude that Ida had documented their ancestors' deaths, ensuring that history couldn't erase them. "She was a stranger to my great-grandfather," one woman said, "but she cared enough to record his story, to interview his widow, to preserve his photograph. She did work his own government wouldn't do. She gave us proof of what happened." The exhibition was planned for February 2025, timed to coincide with the 106th anniversary of the photograph. It would be called "Standing in the Shadows, Ida Freeman and the Documented Terror Against Black Veterans." The centerpiece would be the 1919 photograph, displayed both in its original published form, where Ida was invisible, and in the enhanced version showing her clearly with her sign. Visitors would see what had been hidden for over a century, understand how Ida had positioned herself to be documented, even as she remained unseen by most of the celebration. Ida's archive would be digitized and made accessible to researchers, ensuring that the 67 veterans she documented would be remembered by name, their service honored, their murders acknowledged. And Ida herself would finally receive recognition, not just as a victim of violence, but as a documentarian, an activist, a woman who'd risked and ultimately given her life to ensure that truth wasn't erased. The exhibition opened on February 17, 2025, exactly 106 years after the photograph was taken. The Chicago History Museum was filled beyond capacity. Descendants of murdered veterans, historians, activists, community members, journalists from across the country. The exhibition space was designed to take visitors on a journey. It began with the original 1919 photograph as it appeared in the Chicago Defender, the celebration, the proud soldiers, the joyful community. Visitors saw what readers in 1919 had seen, a moment of hope and recognition. Then, the enhanced version appeared on an adjacent wall, twice the size, with Ida now visible in the doorway, her sign legible. The revelation was powerful. What had seemed like simple celebration was revealed to contain witness to ongoing terror. The next section presented Ida's life, her migration from Mississippi, her work in Chicago, her growing commitment to documenting racial violence. Visitors saw her handwriting and letters, her careful records, her courage in the face of threats. Then came the heart of the exhibition, Ida's documentation of the 67 murdered veterans. Each man had a small display, photograph when available, military service record, circumstances of death, family testimony when Ida had collected it. The cumulative impact was devastating. 67 individual tragedies, 67 instances of racial terrorism, 67 murders that had been ignored or dismissed. Wall text explained the context. The Red Summer of 1919, the systematic violence against black communities, the specific targeting of veterans who challenged Jim Crow's racial hierarchy by their very existence as uniformed soldiers. The final section addressed Ida's murder, the threatening letters, the dismissive police response, the community's recognition of what had happened, and the century of silence that followed. A large panel asked visitors to consider how many other Ida Freemans existed, people who documented injustice, who told truth to power, who were silenced and then forgotten. The exhibition included contemporary context too, connections to modern movements for racial justice, to ongoing work documenting police violence, to the continued necessity of bearing witness to systemic racism. Descendants of the murdered veterans attended the opening, many meeting each other for the first time, discovering shared history of loss and resistance. They stood before displays honoring their ancestors, some weeping, some filled with quiet pride that their loved ones were finally being recognized. Thomas, whose great-grandfather had been lynched in Georgia, spoke during the opening program. "For 106 years, my family carried this story alone. We were told it didn't matter, that it was just something that happened to black people and we should forget it. But Ida Freeman said it mattered. She documented it. She preserved my great-grandfather's name and his story. And now, finally, the world is listening." Media coverage was extensive. The story resonated. A forgotten photograph, a hidden figure finally revealed, an archive of resistance recovered, a woman who'd given her life to document injustice. News outlets around the world ran features about Ida and the veterans she'd honored through her work. But perhaps most significantly, the exhibition sparked conversations about what else remained hidden in historical photographs, in archives, in the shadows. How many other acts of resistance had been documented but not seen? How many other people had stood witness to injustice, only to be erased from memory? The museum created a digital archive of Ida's work, making it accessible to researchers, students, and family members searching for information about ancestors. Within weeks, additional connections were made. More descendants found, more stories recovered, more evidence of the systematic violence that black veterans faced in 1919. Ida's work, preserved in that church basement for over a century, was finally reaching the audience she'd intended. Future generations who needed to understand what had been done, who had resisted, and what courage looked like in the face of terror. 6 months after the exhibition opened, its impact continued to ripple outward. Descendants of the 67 murdered veterans Ida had documented formed an organization dedicated to preserving their ancestors' memories and advocating for historical markers at the sites where they were killed. Several state historical commissions agreed to install commemorative markers, officially acknowledging murders that had been ignored for over a century. In Georgia, a marker was placed near where one veteran had been lynched, reading, Corporal William Anderson, U.S. Army, lynched August 1919 for wearing his military uniform. His murder was documented by Ida Freeman, whose own assassination for her truth-telling work exemplifies the costs of resistance to racial terror. Marcus worked with the Smithsonian to include portions of Ida's archive in the National Museum of African American History and Culture, ensuring permanent national recognition of her work. The museum created an exhibition section on black women documentarians who'd risked their lives to preserve evidence of racial violence. Ida featured prominently alongside better-known figures like Ida B. Wells. Evelyn and Angela co-authored a comprehensive book about Ida's life and work titled Standing in the Shadows, Ida Freeman's Archive of Resistance. The book included reproductions of Ida's documentation, analysis of the systematic violence against black veterans in 1919, and reflection on how historical erasure operates and can be challenged. The book sparked renewed interest in other hidden figures in the fight against racial violence, people who'd done crucial work but had been forgotten or deliberately erased from history. Researchers across the country began searching archives more carefully, using enhanced imaging technology on old photographs, looking for evidence of resistance that had been invisible for generations. A graduate student in North Carolina found another photograph from 1919 that, when enhanced, showed a black woman in the background holding a similar protest sign during a different celebration. Investigation revealed she'd been part of a network of women documentarians working independently but toward the same goal, preserving evidence of racial terrorism. The discovery suggested that Ida hadn't been alone, that there had been others doing similar work, creating a distributed archive of resistance that historians were only now beginning to uncover. Thomas and other descendants pushed for Ida's murder to be officially reopened as a cold case, arguing that even after a century, acknowledgement of what had been done mattered. The Chicago Police Department initially resisted, but public pressure and media attention eventually led to an official statement acknowledging that Ida Freeman's death in 1919 had not been properly investigated, and that available evidence suggested she'd been murdered in retaliation for her activism. It wasn't prosecution, the perpetrators were long dead, but it was official acknowledgement, and that mattered to Ida's memory and to the families who'd been told for generations that their suspicions of murder were unfounded. Grace, the elderly woman whose grandmother had known Ida, attended a memorial service at Olivet Baptist Church, where Ida's archive had been preserved. She spoke about generational memory, about how her grandmother had told her to remember Ida's name, to remember that black women had fought back, had documented injustice, had refused to be silent even when silence would have kept them safer. My grandmother said that someday people would understand what Ida did, Grace said. She said the truth always finds a way to surface, even if it takes 100 years. She was right. The original photograph was now displayed permanently at the Chicago History Museum, with interactive technology allowing visitors to zoom in and see Ida clearly. Children on school field trips stood before it, learning about hidden history, about how resistance sometimes operates in shadows, about the courage required to document truth when powerful forces want it buried. Marcus often stood in the exhibition, watching visitors encounter Ida's story. He thought about that February afternoon in 2024 when he'd first zoomed in on what seemed like an ordinary photograph, revealing the extraordinary. He thought about how close Ida's work had come to being lost forever, preserved only because a church had kept a locked box in its basement for over a century. And he thought about how many other stories remained hidden, waiting for someone to look closely enough, to enhance the image, to zoom in on the shadows where resistance had been operating all along. Ida's story was recovered now, her courage recognized, her work preserved. But she stood for countless others whose documentation of injustice, whose acts of resistance, whose sacrifices remained invisible. The photograph that had gone unnoticed for 100 years was now one of the most viewed images in the museum's collection. And Ida Freeman, who'd stood in shadow holding a sign about murdered veterans, who'd documented 67 deaths before her own assassination, who'd been erased from history for over a century, was finally seen. Her sign in that doorway had declared, "They served, they returned, they were murdered." And now finally, their story, and hers, was being told.